Program is brought to you by the University of Michigan. For more information, visit umich.edu.
Caroline Weber and Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, is a book you can't put down, even for a guy whose first article in Vogue ever was reading an excerpt from this very book. I don't know, maybe I'll start reading Vogue more often if this is the quality of literature that appears, but I think it is. So this volume is genuinely a masterpiece of scholarship and public engagement, of creativity and scholarly integrity, of seriousness and fun. You'll hear why it is today, but I encourage those of you who have not yet read this book to go get it. You might want to wait until tomorrow because I think it's discounted at Borders. But certainly go and get it and read this book, because we learn here, contrary to what I was taught in sociology, that revolutions are not just made on the barricades, but also in the fashion houses, where clothing symbolizes far more than where you stand on the cutting edge. Barnard is very fortunate to have Caroline Weber on its faculty. She's an associate professor of French there, although she's taught at University of Pennsylvania previously. Her work is focused on the Enlightenment and French Revolution, with previous publications including great titles like these: Terror and Its Discontents, Rewriting Rousseau, Freedom's Missed Moment, and Overcoming Excess. Well, I know that last title has a bit of a Lacanian accent. I think we are very fortunate today to have an Ann Arbor accent in Caroline Weber's work. Although we should thank Borders and her extended family for augmenting this visit, I'd like to revel in the jouissance of her time with us today. For all you Lacanians, that's an inside joke. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Caroline Weber to the Center for European Studies at the University of Michigan.
Oh, excuse me. I'm so overcome by the Lacanian introduction. Thank you so much, Michael Kennedy, for that extremely generous, as well as, to me at least, hilarious introduction. My editor, this book, although I'm an academic, was written as a trade book, and my editor wouldn't let me do any Lacanian turns of whimsy in my writing. So if anybody has Lacanian questions afterwards about phallic shapes in Marie Antoinette's hair, all the stuff I wanted to talk about and wasn't allowed to talk about, we can discuss privately in the Q&A. I'm so delighted to be here. It is just an absolute treat and honor and pleasure, and my thanks go to Michael Kennedy, to his colleagues here at the Center for European Studies, Marisha Ostafin, who I had the pleasure of meeting a while ago, Natasha Alaibegovic, did I get it? And of course, my extended family, earlier referred to, especially Sally Stegman DiCarlo, sitting right there in fashionable red glasses. I do have family. My in-laws all live in Ann Arbor, and it's just a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for turning out to listen to my overview of what Marie Antoinette wore to the revolution, the subject of my recent book, and the subject, actually, of this slide that did not appear in Vogue in conjunction with my article there, but rather appeared in Vogue 5 years ago and was really the genesis of the project that became Queen of Fashion. What you're looking at now is, I'm seeing if I can get this a little higher, what you're looking at now is an image from fall of, I think it was October 2000, and it was a Marie Antoinette dress designed by John Galliano for the House of Christian Dior. And as a specialist of the French Revolution and as somebody who loves clothing, I was really struck when I looked more closely at this dress by what it seemed to say and do. What it does is, in addition to kind of there are lovely little Marie Antoinette faces printed along the hem of the dress, and there are some other details that would tell you right away that this is an 18th century French court dress, and one especially associated with the famously cone-headed queen herself because of this high towering headdress that I'll have great chance to talk about later. But what intrigued me the most about this dress were these two panels on either hip, both of which show Marie Antoinette in very different sartorial modes. On the left, my right, your left, of course, is the iconic image of Marie Antoinette in a ragged dress, trudging to the guillotine. The emblem and the bête noire of the revolution, and the emblem of aristocratic and royal excess. For those of you who didn't already know that Marie Antoinette was guillotined, I'm sorry to spoil the end of the story, but that's indeed how it ended for her. And then on the other side, though, what I found so curious, and what I spent the next 5 years really thinking about, was the kind of outfit that John Galliano put her in on the other side, as if to suggest that this one sartorial position led to the other, as if to suggest that the way Marie Antoinette dressed before her demise was somehow interwoven with the story of her ultimate trip to the scaffold. And what was so curious to me about this other outfit, which sadly I don't have a better, more detailed image of for you today, is that it actually conflates two extremes for which Marie Antoinette was equally well known and equally reviled during her time in France in the last third of the 18th century. On the one hand, Marie Antoinette is wearing, and you'll have to take my word for it because it's faded in the slide, Marie Antoinette is wearing in this embroidered hip panel one of her signature 3-foot-high poof headdresses, which you see echoed on the model. This was an innovation of Marie Antoinette's that we still associate with her image, and it was a way that Marie Antoinette actually hit upon to raise her visibility both figuratively and literally in the public eye at a time when she was very much not welcome in the French kingdom. So on the one hand, there's this ostentatious overdress that Marie Antoinette adopted at the level of hair, for which she was famed and for which she was roundly criticized. But on the other hand, on the bottom half of her person, Marie Antoinette is dressed in a very different mode. She's dressed in her equally notorious and I think equally mythical today shepherdess outfit. Many of us know that Marie Antoinette liked to escape the constraints and conventions of the very formal court at Versailles, where her husband, the king, lived and ruled. And she would escape to this little country retreat called the Petit Trianon, where she essentially suspended all of the rules of royal French etiquette and dressed and played at being a commoner. And so she tended flocks of perfumed sheep, some of which she had dyed pink to match her outfits. Anyway, and the outfits that she wore there, and I'll show you more images of those today, were considered quite scandalous and shocking in a queen precisely because they got rid of all of the standard elements that would have made her recognizable as such to her subjects. So on the one hand, what Marie Antoinette's contemporaries referred to, often in very shocked tones, as her revolution in fashion, on the one hand, this revolution comprised excessive overdress and crazy hair, and on the other hand, radical underdress or downdressing, or some critics even said undressing, these kind of nightgown-like chemise shepherdess dresses that were equally unexpected of a woman of her station. And so what, again, Galliano's dress that I found by happenstance in Vogue seems to suggest is that there is some kind of a link between Marie Antoinette's ultimate downfall and the experiments she performed in fashion at both extremes, extreme overdress and extreme underdress. And I'd like to take you through that story today, looking at the story of Marie Antoinette's rise and fall through the lens of her choices in fashion. So I'd like to emphasize that from the outset, I'm going to see if I can let this droop. From the outset, Marie Antoinette was trained in matters of appearance. From the moment at age 13, when she was just in 1768, when she was tapped to be the wife of the future French king Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette was informed that in order to look the part of the proper Bourbon princess, she would have to undergo what we would today call an extreme makeover of serious proportions. Marie Antoinette hailed from a royal Austrian family, from the imperial Habsburg family in Vienna, and this was a place where compared to by French standards, it was almost alarmingly relaxed in its etiquette and in its approach to appearance. Marie Antoinette and her dozen or so, depending on who had not yet died off of various unfortunate diseases, her dozen or so siblings were essentially, except on state occasions, left to run free and to wear clothes that didn't really reflect their royal rank. But at Versailles, Marie Antoinette was taught at the age of 13, operated according to a very different protocol. If you were a member of the royal family at Versailles, you had to look the part of a royal every minute of every day of your life. And this was a serious matter. It was a matter that had been codified and really turned into royal practice by the great absolutist monarch Louis XIV in the 17th century. And the idea behind it was essentially that in order for the people to worship their king and to recognize him as a supreme power second only to God and chosen by God, he had to look more divine, more splendid, more majestic than anybody else around him. And this principle extended to members of his family, and indeed to everybody at his court. At court, there are lots of hilarious contemporary memoirs from the 17th and 18th centuries describing how one could tell exactly where a particular aristocrat stood in the court pecking order according to how high his high-heeled shoes were for the gentleman, for the vogue-reading gentleman, or how long her train was for the court ladies, that every little detail of clothing reflected one's position in the court hierarchy. So at age 13, Viennese Marie Antoinette, not at all schooled in these matters, is suddenly given a crash course in this idea and told that she will never pass muster at Versailles unless she gets transformed into a creature of complete, appropriately Bourbon magnificence and splendor. The extreme makeover wasn't easy. First and foremost, and this horrified my dentist in New York when I told this to her, we have reports that Marie Antoinette was told that her teeth weren't straight enough for the Bourbon court, that she didn't look pretty enough and that she didn't look royal enough when she smiled. And so over the course of 3 months with no anesthesia, her teeth were knocked out and moved around to give her what one finally approving French diplomat reported as an acceptably straight and beautiful smile. Marie Antoinette's hair was also thought to be too frizzy and brutishly Austrian, and so she had sent to her, or her mother had sent to her. Her mother was the empress of the Habsburg Empire, Maria Theresa. Her mother had sent to her the most famous hairdresser in France, who had been the personal hairdresser to the previous queen, dead 2 years before, to remake Marie Antoinette's hair. And here's Marie Antoinette at age 14, once she's undergone this makeover, especially with the hair. She's wearing what was then known as a pompadour, a little bit lower than the pompadour we know today, but it was modeled on the pompadour hairstyle worn by the eponymous mistress of Louis XV, the still reigning king and grandfather to Marie Antoinette's husband-to-be, and the one who would turn over his throne to Marie Antoinette's husband when he died. So Marie Antoinette had it impressed upon her from this very young age that her looks and her appearance were a matter of the utmost concern, focus, interest, and political importance at the court of Versailles. Last but not least, after the teeth, the hair, she also had to have special and intensive lessons learning how to walk properly in the very restrictive costume of Versailles, which involved corsets so tight that women tended to faint and have asthma attacks, bad breath, and indigestion because their innards were so badly constricted. But if you were to look almost divine, if you were to look superior to all other mortals, you had to learn to move in that uncomfortable costume as well, as if it weren't a problem. And so Marie Antoinette was also taught to perfect what was known as the Versailles glide, where it looked like she wasn't walking at all, even if her train was 20 feet long, even if her hoop skirts were 12 feet wide, and even if all of these accoutrements were likely to get snagged or caught in doorways or on furniture, or most embarrassingly of all, on other women's costumes. There are also really funny memoirs describing the shame that falls on an entire family if a young woman goes to Versailles and trips on her train or has her hoop skirt get wedged against somebody else's in a doorway. So Marie Antoinette had to prepare to face all of these obstacles at a very young age, I think younger than any of us are here in this room today. But then finally, she was told that because she was an Austrian and because Austria was viewed by the French as really a savage outpost of non-civilization in Europe, Marie Antoinette couldn't possibly show up in France with any clothes made in Austria. So her mother hired a small army of French fashion purveyors to come straight from Paris, then recognized as the capital of European fashion, and we can talk more about that in a moment, I will, to outfit this woman, this young woman, in clothes that were entirely French-made. And Marie Antoinette's mother spent somewhere between 2 and 3 million contemporary dollars on the trousseau that was to send her across the border into France looking like a princess. Now, I emphasize all of this because of the fact that Marie Antoinette really learned very intensively from a young age that fashion was a matter of political power, and it was hers to wield or to have wielded against her. Unfortunately for you need to, oh, thank you. Unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, that was only one half of the job. Look at, thank you, so I'm not hunching so much. It's not very Versailles to be hunching like this. Thank you very much. Again, I give you Michael Kennedy. Anyway, so that was only one half of the job. Looking the part was a very important part of Marie Antoinette's role as future Queen of France, and when she arrived at Versailles in May of 1770, many people, even the many people at Versailles who didn't quite like the idea of a boorish Austrian woman one day on the throne, because this is how Austrians were generally seen by the French, and some still are today, I think. That even Marie Antoinette's detractors at courts seemed to acknowledge that she had done a pretty good job, and that for a foreigner, she looked pretty refined, she looked pretty elegant, she looked pretty French. And they begrudged her this because, in fact, Marie Antoinette's marriage to the future King of France had been contracted precisely to reverse a centuries-old enmity between the two nations. And this was a decision that had more or less been made unilaterally by the then reigning king, Louis XV, Marie Antoinette's grandfather-in-law, but it had thousands of opponents at court. And when Marie Antoinette arrived, there were already large and very powerful factions of courtiers plotting Marie Antoinette's disgrace and trying to figure out a way to get her sent back to Austria so that a different princess could be chosen as future queen, so that France would be rescued from this horrible and shameful rapprochement with the Austrian Habsburgs. Now, Marie Antoinette, by looking as elegant as she did when she first arrived, didn't exactly gratify her opponents on this front, but she did manage to play into their hands on another front, which represented the other part of her main obligation at Versailles, which was her obligation to procreate and to bear as many Bourbon heirs as possible, as quickly as possible. Like all royal dynasties, the Bourbons were tremendously preoccupied with the idea of shoring up the succession, and the succession had had several alarming gaps in it already. Marie Antoinette's own husband had only become king or heir to the throne after the death of 2 brothers and his father as well. So Marie Antoinette's job was to start having children, and indeed, this was the one thing that her predecessor, Maria Leszczyńska, who had died in 1768 and whose hairdresser Marie Antoinette had used, had been exemplary at. Maria Leszczyńska was born in Poland and had been similarly looked down upon by members of the French court for coming from another brutish outpost of Europe. But she was somebody who more or less towed the line of Versailles Protocol. She spent, believe it or not, on this sort of dowdy portrait, she spent a lot of money on clothes, but they were always very traditional, very conservative. They always respected the established rules for Bourbon queenly dress. And more importantly still, she had a lot of children, and she got out of her husband's way. The role of the king at Versailles was to be the one who dazzled, who commanded all attention. The queen was supposed to bear him his heirs and then let him be the center of the show. This, unfortunately, for Marie Antoinette would not be possible and would not prove to be the case, in no small part because her husband, Louis Auguste, future King of France, refused to sleep with her for the first 7.5 years of their marriage. This is an awfully long time to have your husband avoiding the marriage bed under any circumstances, I think. But it was especially challenging for Marie Antoinette because it prevented her from doing what she was there, after all, to do, which was to have Bourbon Habsburg babies that would one day be able to rule France. Marie Antoinette's enemies took advantage of this problem, and that we can talk in the Q&A about why her husband refused to sleep with her for 7.5 years. Scholars have a lot of different hypotheses about that, as do I. But the bottom line was, he did, although he was very friendly towards her, and they struck up a very close friendship over the first few years of her time at Versailles, he did continue to avoid consummating the union, and this left Marie Antoinette faced with all these people who wanted her out of Versailles, having to act quickly to find another way to uphold this new alliance between Austria and France. She received regular letters from her mother. Her mother was kind of a classic stage mother or Little League parent, reminding her every week, by the way, I hear you're not pregnant yet. By the way, what are you doing about getting pregnant? By the way, when are you going to, and it wasn't just give me some grandchildren, it was, when are you going to do your job by the Bourbon dynasty? That's what you're supposed to be there for. You tell me your husband doesn't want to sleep with you, make him want to sleep with you. And Marie Antoinette tried and tried and tried, and nothing seemed to work in terms of thawing the icy demeanor of her new husband. And so she turned instead, with this training in fashion, to what a British reviewer of the British edition of my book recently called the Queen of Hearts approach, the Princess Diana approach, where Marie Antoinette seems to have realized sometime in the early 1770s, when as still a young teenager, she and her friends from court would sneak off from Versailles to Paris to see what was going on and have some fun in the big city, that there was a larger world beyond the gates of Versailles where she could be somebody who was admired, adored, and indeed worshipped. Unlike Maria Leczinska, who had really stayed hidden at Versailles throughout her life, Marie Antoinette started going to Paris more and more and became something of a celebrity there. And she enhanced her own celebrity by working with a pair of famous Parisian stylists who she met there to essentially cultivate her image as a queen of fashion, as a beautiful icon who was commented on breathlessly in the burgeoning media. Indeed, Marie Antoinette in many ways is responsible for the birth of the French fashion media. The first fashion magazines really developed to meet the public appetite for knowing what Marie Antoinette was wearing at any given public Parisian public ball or promenade like the Champs-Élysées or the Bois de Boulogne. Marie Antoinette basically used fashion to heighten her image in the public eye. And for the first few years, this actually seemed to work. I mentioned that she had found these two famous French stylists in Paris. And this is an anonymous image from the mid-1770s. One could, before the French Revolution, one could always get in trouble by identifying the queen by name in a caricature, especially. So this is anonymous, but this seems to be Marie Antoinette and her two so-called ministers of fashion, as the public dubbed them. This is Monsieur Léonard on my left, her male hairdresser, who up until meeting the Queen had pretty much made his fortune through more dubious contact with kept women of the opera and of the theater scene, rich mistresses of rich aristocrats, but of very low birth and questionable morals, who had a taste for the flashy, some would even say the tacky, and Monsieur Léonard was all too happy to indulge their whims. Together with another woman who had also catered to this audience until meeting a very fashion-friendly young queen is Rose Bertin, who's on my right. And Rose Bertin and Léonard in 1774, which was the year Marie Antoinette turned 19, it was the year that she and her husband acceded to the throne, Monsieur Léonard and Rose Bertin invented what would become Marie Antoinette's hallmark look, the pouf headdress. And the pouf was great because the pouf was such an over-the-top, such an ostentatious kind of fashion statement. Marie Antoinette was one of the earliest adopters of this look that it really did give her a new kind of celebrity and notoriety in Paris, and even a new kind of love from the Parisian people for the moment, while back home at Versailles, the anti-Austrian factions were still plotting and gossiping and snickering about the fact that she hadn't yet born a child. And what I love about this image in particular is it sort of shows what the pouf was capable of doing. The pouf was a 3-foot-high or so headdress that was built on an edifice of wire, horsehair, cotton pads, fake hair, and then the wearer's own hair kind of teased up to cover it all, doused in very heavy hair powder, and then festooned with any number of different accessories and instruments. So one of Marie Antoinette's favorite looks, apparently, was the plain pouf just accessorized with these high ostrich feathers. And there was a pun on Austria. Some might say that Marie Antoinette was announcing her own Austrian heritage because ostrich in French is Autriche and Austria in French is Autriche. And it guaranteed that instead of just being 3 feet higher than most of the women in the room, Marie Antoinette would be about 6 feet higher than most of the women in the room if she showed up at a ball in these feathers, and she did. But here what we see is actually Monsieur Léonard taking out the feathers of her hair, leaving the underlying pouf scaffolding in place in order for Rose Bertin to insert another set of accessories in it here. And this is a pouf that Marie Antoinette is actually known to have worn. It's called the pouf à la jardinière, the gardener's pouf. And it involved a bunch of fresh vegetables. And Marie Antoinette famously walked around Versailles as well as Paris with a whole head of cabbage in her hair, along with a bunch of radishes, carrots, tomatoes, sweet peas, other vegetables, and in fact to the point where the women who wanted to curry favor with the queen, who were many, actually came up to her one day and said, "I will never wear anything again in my hair but vegetables, Your Majesty. They look so much fresher than flowers." Now, this is a big difference between the pouf and this hairdo, right? Where they're the flowers that have been abandoned in favor of fresh vegetables. Marie Antoinette is carving out her own territory. She's redefining what a French queen is supposed to look like. In so doing, she garners ever more critics at court who can't believe that the queen is daring to depart from this nicely, rigidly, in fact, established way of dressing when you're a member of the royal family. But instead, Marie Antoinette gained a larger public. She also gained an ability to play at politics with her hair and to thwart her enemies even with her hair. One of the things about the pouf that was great was the pouf was divided into 2 categories. There was the sentimental pouf, the pouf au sentiment, which was basically a way for the wearer to express his or her own feeling of the moment. Marie Antoinette at this moment had fallen in love with gardening, and so went the pouf à la jardinière. But the pouf, another version of the pouf, this is another pouf Marie Antoinette wore, was called the pouf à la circonstance, the current events pouf. And there, the wearer could show his or usually her, sometimes men wore poufs, and we can talk about that later, but to show her involvement in and awareness of particular events of the day. This is a pouf Marie Antoinette wore in the 1770s to show her support for France's participation in the American War of Independence. And this was perhaps apparently the pouf that spawned the most copycats in Paris. And indeed, there are more engravings of Marie Antoinette and her followers in this pouf than any other in the French archives that I visited. And it was something that did come as something of a shock. So Marie Antoinette could kind of make statements. In fact, she often made anti-Austrian statements in her poufs. One cabal at court, led by the old king's mistress, Madame du Barry, had tried to shame Marie Antoinette publicly at the debut of an opera that Marie Antoinette had organized in the mid-1770s. And Marie Antoinette got wind of this plot, gathered an even larger group of friends to go with her to the opera, got all of her friends to applaud wildly, drowning out the boos. The opera Marie Antoinette had sponsored, which was Gluck's Iphigénie, became the success of the season, and Marie Antoinette paraded around court in a little, in a pouf with little miniature characters from Iphigénie, essentially to show her enemies at court that she had won and to celebrate her victory over them. So the pouf was infinitely personalizable, it was infinitely flexible, and it was very, very conspicuous. I mentioned in the early days of her reign, this really worked well for Marie Antoinette. There were apparently thousands of women scrambling to copy the queen however they could. There was the birth of a modern fashion magazine industry, avidly covering the queen's ever-changing fashions, especially at the level of her hair. But this was something that also, as the 1770s wore on and France went deeper and deeper into economic decline, largely as a function of their huge investment in our war for independence, more and more people, more conservative critics of the Queen, started pointing out that the Queen essentially was doing the throne no favors by deviating so far from the established norms that had dominated other queens' comportment for generations. This is a portrait of Marie Antoinette as she was supposed to have looked at her coronation in 1775. A year after she fell in love with the pouf, a year after she had already become a French queen of fashion, they had to wait wait a year because of mourning for the old king before they could have this big festivity for the new king and queen. This was the idealized portrait of how Marie Antoinette was supposed to look. Low hair, no poof, big wide dress embroidered in fleur de lis, the flower of the Bourbon monarchy, the lily, the long train, the ermine robe, the whole 9 yards. Instead, Marie Antoinette and her friends showed up at coronation in something infinitely more modern. You can see the poof hairdo. This is not at the coronation, but this is a print contemporary with that moment. And apparently onlookers were scandalized at the sort of frilly, flirty, coquettish, excessive, girly trimmings that Marie Antoinette and her friends had adopted on their dresses in order to match the over-the-top coquettishness of their poofs. And some critics even said that Marie Antoinette's hair was so high it blocked the view of the king's coronation itself. Here, Marie Antoinette couldn't be moving farther from the model established by her predecessors, like Maria Leszczyńska. Marie Antoinette was eclipsing her husband, the king, and for that, many French people of all classes never forgave her. Things got worse when rumors were circulated in Paris largely by Marie Antoinette's aristocratic enemies at court, several of whom had printing presses in the capital city. Rumors started being circulated that Marie Antoinette was costing the throne ridiculous amounts of money, not just because she was spending so much on fashion, which was obvious, but because of the fact that her poofs had grown so huge that she was making her husband rebuild parts of Versailles and perform major alterations to the architecture of Versailles in order to accommodate her headdresses. And this is a satirical proof from that era called the ridiculous poof that seems to play on that rumor. And in fact, it was true that it was hard to get through the door with one of these poofs. This kind of leaning would not have been out of place. And in fact, 3 French women died in the 1770s from their poofs getting caught on chandeliers. So it was a real problem, but Marie Antoinette never did, in fact, demand any architectural changes at Versailles. The rumor, though, was hugely damaging to her reputation because here she was not only defying the conventions for queenly dress, she was daring to tinker with the underlying sacred and majestic architecture of the place that best expressed royal power. The idea that a foreign woman would come in and demand that changes be made to Versailles was absolutely unthinkable to many of the French. And so this is where Marie Antoinette's public image started to go from the Princess Diana, Queen of Hearts, can't wait to see what she's wearing, to how dare she, and the pun that was used against her quite often, the word Autrichienne, Austrian woman, also meant that Austrian bitch. And this was how she started to be referred to in the clandestine press that would never let up against her. Marie Antoinette's reputation took another blow in the mid-1770s when, at a moment called the Flower Wars, when after a series of bad harvests, thousands of French people were left lacking grain, flour, and bread. And it was pointed out that Marie Antoinette's hair powder itself used flour as one of its major ingredients, and it was thought then that Marie Antoinette's hairdos were not only wrecking things at Versailles, were not only eclipsing the king, but were also quite literally consuming the resources that would have been better allocated to a starving people. During the Flower Wars, 5,000 people stormed the gates of Versailles, demanding that Marie Antoinette give up the resources she had been harboring for her own use. And I think that that really is where "let them eat cake," the legendary phrase that she never said but that is attached to her name, came from. This idea that Marie Antoinette was consuming flour and building these wedding cake-like hairstyles at a time when her people were starving. Worse still, her favorite stylist, Rose Bertin, whom I showed you before with the vegetables, commemorated the flour riots by inventing a pouf à la révolte, a revolt poof, presumably showing bakers' shops getting stormed in the capital city. This was not something that did any wonders for Marie Antoinette's public reputation. It was viewed as a show of absolute and unforgivable callousness. And here we can see the kind of hostility that the poofs had started to generate in this print, where a woman, again anonymous, walking with a man who's been rendered effeminate and ridiculous by wearing a mini poof, trying to copy the queen. And indeed, Marie Antoinette surrounded herself with very fashion-forward men who weren't willing to look a little bit ridiculous in order to curry her favor. She's shown strolling in the Bois de Boulogne or in some public park, and these men fire, instead of at these nice available actual geese overhead, they fire at her swan or her bird-shaped poof. So of course it's ridiculous, but it's also a sign of the aggression and the disapproval that her hairstyles had started to generate in the capital. Marie Antoinette seems to have gotten the message that this means of cultivating the public's approval wasn't the best way to go. And by the late 1770s, she had really started avoiding Paris more and more. By the late 70s, she still continued to have trouble with her enticing her husband to bed, but she set up basically another alternative route for establishing her own power at Versailles. Still under the gun, still with factions plotting against her at Versailles, she essentially left Versailles to the little country palace, the Petit Trianon, that her husband had given her on their accession, and set up a counter court at the Petit Trianon. This was a place where, scandalously, and for the first time in French history, Marie Antoinette, instead of the king, issued all of the decrees connected to gardening, interior decor, behavior, parties, and dress. The standard royal formula was, by order of the king, these people will wear this. By order of the king, there will be this costume party at Versailles. Marie Antoinette started signing decrees by order of the queen, and one of the things that she mandated was that her followers at this counter court, who consisted in her close friends and sympathizers, abandon the standard traditional ceremonial garb that had been so long favored at Versailles and so long reflective of their status. This was the unofficial uniform of the Petit Trianon, as stipulated by the queen. So with this very kind of dress, Marie Antoinette was showing on her body the independence that she was trying to declare from a court that still very much didn't want her there, and a court in which she still had no traditionally viable place because she still hadn't had any children. This dress is a combination of two fashion statements that Marie Antoinette often liked to make separately as well as together. This is a portrait from 1778. This is Marie Antoinette shown in the gardens at the Petit Trianon, and what she's wearing is for starters, she's gotten rid of the offensive hair powder. She's wearing no makeup, which was something that was very unusual for aristocratic women who were always required to wear thick pancake makeup and rouge and beauty marks. You guys have all seen those mouches, those beauty marks that they wore, again, to show their status. Marie Antoinette got rid of all of that artifice. And in addition, she started wearing a dress that couldn't have been more different from the paniered, tightly corseted, heavy-trained gowns of Versailles, this white muslin chemise dress, which was very plain, very unstructured. It got its structure really only from a sash worn around the waist, no intense stomacher and corset, or from a tight-fitted jacket, which was called the redingote, or the riding coat, which was also a fashion innovation of Marie Antoinette's at this time, which reflected her love of horseback riding. Here's Marie Antoinette in a portrait that scandalized Versailles because she's riding this horse like a man. In men's pants, she's straddling it, she's not riding side saddle, and it was thought that she had directly copied some of the absolutist posturing of Louis XIV, who was her husband's and her own ancestor 100 years before. But what was shocking also about Marie Antoinette's choice of the redingote was the fact, again, that it seemed to suggest her willingness to eclipse the king or assume a kind of kingly authority for herself. There's nothing particularly feminine about this coat dress that she's wearing over the white dress. It's unornamented, it's tailored in a mannish style, and it was something that was viewed as shockingly masculine at the time. Just as shocking, though, was the underlying fact of this little white dress. And some costume historian friend of mine pointed out to me when I was talking to her about Marie Antoinette's sort of revolution in fashion that the little white dress really was the most revolutionary garb in European fashion until Chanel's little black dress of the 1920s, because it was comfortable, it was modern, it didn't require this intensely complicated understructure and architecture and carriage to hold it up. It was basically a lot of white muslin, worn with a sash belted at the waist with kind of a ruffle at the collar. So it was very, very easy to wear. It facilitated a much more modern range of motion and activities. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette could have picnics with her friends, run around on the grass. Those of you who've seen Sofia Coppola's film might remember some of the most beautiful scenes in the movie, I think, are shot of all of them having a distinctly unroyal, casual time of it at the Petit Trianon. But it was also revolutionary in another sense, which again got Marie Antoinette into trouble. The little white dress was a lot less expensive to make. and a lot less complicated to put together than the kinds of dresses she had worn at Versailles that had marked her stature as the Queen of France. This was a dress that was so widely copied that, according to several contemporary reporters, by 1780, the streets of Paris were flooded with little white dresses, and you could see anyone from a prostitute to a princess running around in exactly the same kind of dress. This was scandalous in 18th century France, a place where one's rank had always been legible on the surface of one's garments. And this is a portrait from, I think, 1781 of Marie Antoinette's great nemesis, Madame du Barry. Marie Antoinette, the one that she had trounced with her opera pouf, Madame du Barry, everyone knew, had been born a common prostitute, the daughter of a prostitute and a priest, in fact. She was somebody who, even though she had won royal favor as Louis XV's mistress before Marie Antoinette and her husband came to the throne, she was somebody who was thought to be quite tacky, somebody whose clothing was always in poor taste, somebody who always betrayed her lowly origins. And the fact that even Madame du Barry apparently became so enamored of this white dress that she wore it in spring, summer, fall, and winter, even though she could afford much better, was a sign of how popular the dress had become across all social categories. This was something, again, that the French didn't like. The French didn't like Marie Antoinette for making their society a place where social distinctions were no longer visible in one's clothes. Marie Antoinette herself threw fuel on this fire in 1783 when she posed for this now famous portrait by Vigée Lebrun, her favorite artist. This is called Marie Antoinette en chemise, in her chemise dress. And what was considered so scandalous about this portrait when Marie Antoinette, by her own orders, had it shown at a public exhibition at the Louvre, where lots of people got to see it from, again, all walks of life, was that there was nothing royal about her appearance in this portrait. There's not a single marker of her royal stature. There are no Bourbon lilies. There's no ermine. There's no crown. There's not even any fancy jewelry. It's just the queen in her Petit Trianon outfit, a simple straw hat, no makeup, unpowdered hair, and this dress that was so scandalous to several commentators at the Louvre that some people described it as the queen having been painted as in her underwear. One really funny commentator talked about the queen dressed up as a poor little wench selling lemonade in a provincial French village. But the worst of all was the queen had tricked herself out like a prostitute. And indeed, 3 years later, when an infamous jewel heist called the Diamond Necklace Affair erupted in France, it was found out that a real prostitute actually dressed just like Marie Antoinette in this portrait in order to get her hands on an invaluable diamond necklace in the Queen's name. Marie Antoinette, although she had nothing to do with the affair, was held guilty by association largely because she had instigated this revolution that made it possible for prostitutes to dress like queens. The portrait was so scandalous at the Salon, created such an outroar that Marie Antoinette got her portraitist to pull it out of the show and repaint her quickly in what was a much more French-looking costume, a much more royal-looking costume. Silk dress, jewelry, majestic-looking headdress that tried to remind the people that, after all, she was towing the line. She could also just play at being a standard conventional queen. But the people continued to rail against Marie Antoinette in the clandestine press, even though Marie Antoinette then kept having her favorite portraitist churn out portraits of her in a much more conventional mode. Here again, Marie Antoinette is wearing very sumptuous ermine-trimmed court dress made out of good French-made silk velvet. The other problem with Marie Antoinette's chemise dresses is that they were made from British and Austrian imported muslin. The French certainly didn't appreciate the Queen supporting these foreign industries. And then by the late 1780s, Marie Antoinette had actually finally managed to lure her husband into the bedchamber, and she had managed to give France a small pack of royal children. So she had portraits painted to commemorate that as well, reminding the French that, after all, she could be a good queen and not this hated Austrian bitch that was being gossiped about and whose every fashion choice was now being dissected with tremendous vitriol and intense criticism. But the French weren't satisfied by now with those images of Marie Antoinette, and by the time the revolution erupted in 1789, the clandestine press became ever bolder and more vehement in its condemnations of the Queen and declared that the Queen was a shapeshifter, but that the leopard could never really change her spots. She could overdress, she could underdress, she could look like a regular queen, but underneath it all, she was a nefarious Austrian woman who had dared one too many times to go against the standard expectations for a woman in her role. And indeed, it's significant that the revolution, when the revolutionaries stormed Versailles in 1789, the only bedroom and the only belongings they destroyed were Marie Antoinette's. Some of the women who stormed the palace at that time said they wanted to eviscerate the queen and turn her guts into red ribbons for their hats, trying to reverse her reputation as queen of fashion and show how much they hated her, but how they hoped to use her body for their own adornment. The intensity of the anger against the queen in particular continued throughout the revolution. And by 1792, this is an image from August 1792, the people were ready to throw their king and queen in jail, which they did. And this is an image showing the king and queen dragged out of their palace at the Tuileries, where they had been brought after the fall of Versailles in 1789. And this is a really interesting symbolic gesture and symbolic moment in the history of the revolution, because here the Revolutionary Guards are clamping one of their favorite emblems, the red bonnet of liberty, on the head of their king, showing, and the red bonnet of liberty was a symbol that had been worn in Greece by freed slaves, and the revolutionaries had adopted it to show their freedom from the slavery that the crown had imposed upon them. Louis XVI apparently calmly accepted this symbolic deposal of his crown by the revolution. Marie Antoinette, whose politics were actually quite far to the right of her husband's, reportedly took the revolutionary bonnet and stamped it on the ground and said, "You'll never let you put that on, especially in front of my young son," who's shown right there. So Marie Antoinette had tried one more time to defy the revolution, to defy the sort of established codes for how she was supposed to behave. She was supposed to accept the triumph of the revolution like her husband had done. That's what the people expected of her. But it wasn't something that she was willing to do. She and her husband were, and their two surviving children were put in jail in August of 1792. In January of 1793, her husband was executed, and Marie Antoinette made one last very iconoclastic request. She asked that her captors bring her mourning clothes to mourn the death of her husband. And this was a striking gesture because it was illegal outside of her prison walls to actually show any mourning for the king. The king's execution had represented the definitive fall of the monarchy. If you were seen in the streets of Paris, even wearing a black armband or a black ribbon in your hat that would have suggested some sympathy towards the fallen king and the fallen order, you could be beaten up or dragged to the guillotine and killed for your royalist sentiments. But Marie Antoinette made no bones of her royalist sentiments from within her jail cell. And she insisted, in fact, on wearing this black dress once she got it. And amazingly, her captors gave it to her for 10 months, never taking it off her body once, because apparently she wanted, her one last wish was that when she was guillotined, she wanted to die with the colors of mourning, and black also happened to be the color of Austria and the color of the French aristocracy. She wanted to die with those colors on her body, defining herself through her fashions one last time. Unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, this strategy didn't serve her too well with her captors. This is a portrait painted from life of her in prison later in 1793. Her hair had turned completely white by the age of 37. She had lost a huge amount of weight. She looked quite skeletal, and her dress, because she had worn this black dress every day for 10 months, had fallen into rags by the time in the fall of 1793 that she was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal and also accused of being an enemy of France. And the reason I say this strategy didn't serve Marie Antoinette well is that when Marie Antoinette showed up for her trial, she showed up in an audience of people who were largely expecting to see the queen either tricked out like a whore in one of her chemises or dressed in one of these poofs that they had read so much about. And instead, by showing up in these kind of unrepentant but also very pathos-ridden black rags, where she's still mourning her dead husband, and by this time her two children have been taken away from her as well, she apparently elicited a lot of unexpected sympathy even from the fervent supporters of the revolution who had come to watch her condemned to death. Fortunately for the government, Marie Antoinette was still condemned to death. The jury had been handpicked before and had promised to find her guilty of any and all charges that were leveled against her, one of which included channeling money to foreign countries for muslin. Another one included hogging all the flour for herself. Marie Antoinette was sentenced to die the next day, and her captors, having realized that she looked a little bit too sympathetic in this raggedy black dress, sent somebody to her prison in the middle of the night to say, "You're not allowed to wear that dress anymore. you can't travel through the streets of Paris tomorrow where tens of thousands of people will turn out to see you die looking like a royalist martyr. And what's so amazing to me, and this is, to me, is probably the most moving part of her story, is that according to the one serving girl who'd been hired to wait on Marie Antoinette in her 6-by-6-foot jail cell, Marie Antoinette seems to have anticipated even this outcome. Her first choice was to wear her black rags to the guillotine, but barring that, she had somehow managed to keep hidden in this tiny cell in a hole in the wall a pristine white dress, reminiscent of the dresses she had favored for the Petit Trianon. So this was the dress that she put on for her execution, and again, apparently it created shock and awe throughout the French capital when she was paraded through the streets. White was also the color of the Bourbon lily flower, as well as the color of the Petit Trianon. This was Marie Antoinette's signature look. It was also a color that, like black, had become illegal by late 1793 because it represented sympathy for the monarchy. And Marie Antoinette was without incident and without anybody apparently daring to scream or throw things at her as they had done to other victims of the guillotine. She paraded to the guillotine in this tremendously dignified white dress, and this is an image of Marie Antoinette dying in her white dress, being executed. And to me, it's an amazing finale for a career that had involved an attempt always to use fashion to protect herself and to shore up her authority, but it was also a testament to the fact that her fashions could do too little as well as too much. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions if we have a little time. And maybe the lights, if you guys want to turn the lights up, I don't mind. I can see you all as it is. But any thoughts, any questions? Yes, please.
Was there any indication about how tall the tallest ones were and how she actually moved around with that?
Yeah, it's said that generally the tallest one that I've seen commented on was the one that she wore to her husband's coronation in 1775, and it was said that it was so tall that it made her face look like the midpoint between the top of her head and the hem of her dress, which I love. So we don't have a lot of measurements. Generally, we know that they were about 3 feet high, but they could be made a lot higher with the addition of feathers, which were a big favorite accoutrement of Marie Antoinette's. And strangely, the feathers were thought to be even more expensive than jewels. So a lot of the revolutionary portraiture or revolutionary caricatures that were done of her reminding the public why this woman needed to be killed, especially in the 1790s, showed her wearing these feathers. So you'd see like animals like Marie Antoinette as a leopard, but with feathers sprouting from her hair. And that seemed to be the most economical way the caricaturists had of reminding people of these very extravagant, very towering headdresses. They also had to sleep sitting up, by the way. You would have to sleep sitting up in a special kind of pyramid-shaped bandage propped up on a bunch of pillows because the pouf was so complicated to make. Even if you were Marie Antoinette and you could afford to have it remade every day, the time alone was so considerable that it's thought that she also had to sleep sitting up. And she would often have to ride on her knees in a carriage to get to a ball. And there's one very, very funny public or contemporary memoir that talks about seeing Marie Antoinette getting to a ball at the Palais Royal, and she'd had her hair dressed in Paris, in Versailles, so she'd ridden the 15 miles into Paris, and trying to not be seen as she sort of sneaked out of her carriage and had her team rebuild the pouf that had gotten mashed and flattened, and they'd had to take stuff out of it during the carriage ride, and then they put the boat back in and the feathers and whatever else. So we know it was really hard, and there are great contemporary caricatures showing women riding with their heads out of carriage windows, and famous ones of women's hair tangling with the chandeliers because apparently that was a real health risk. But yeah. Another question I get asked a lot is how much they weighed, and I just don't know. But good thing she had that ballet training. Yeah, that's all I can say. She was the only one who could look good. Yes, please, the handsome gentleman over there. Yeah.
Did the pouf originate with Marie Antoinette, or was it something that she popularized? And what did it catch on in other courts?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. The pouf didn't originate with Marie Antoinette, but she was one of its very earliest adopters. It's thought that the first person to wear the pouf was one of Marie Antoinette's few very good friends at the court of Versailles, her cousin-in-law, one of the princesses of the blood. And this princess, not incidentally, had also had problems getting her royal husband to sleep with her. But this, in the case of that husband, he was sleeping with everybody else, just not with his wife. So by the time the wife finally got pregnant and gave birth to a long-awaited son, one of the first documented poofs is a poof this woman wore to celebrate that was actually a childbirth scene of herself giving birth to the baby. Yeah, we don't have any pictures of that, and I don't know if I would show them even if I did. But and it was widely reported in the press. And so that woman, the Princesse de Chartres, is thought to be the one who introduced Marie Antoinette to this team of stylists before the poof was really well known at all. Marie Antoinette was absolutely the popularizer of it. It absolutely became synonymous with her name. And her hairdresser wrote these really, really entertaining memoirs where he talked about the huge public frenzy that she would cause whenever she showed up anywhere, and people breaking each other's ribs to get a look at the latest poof and then to go home and try to emulate it in their way. And yet, caught on at other courts. One of the other innovations of this pair of stylists was, especially because fashion magazines were only just getting started in France and still weren't widely disseminated throughout Europe or the world, as of course they are today, the best way of disseminating fashion to other courts was to send these fashion dolls to other courts dressed in the latest styles. They were also known as Pandoras, and the innovation that Marie Antoinette's stylists came up with is they created a life-sized mannequin of Marie Antoinette herself with different poofs and dresses and sent those to different courts. And apparently there are great contemporary comments saying things like the Pandoras were greeted with as much excitement as if it had been the queen herself. So that was the way that look caught on throughout Europe. I mean, she really was the queen of fashion for all of Europe for that time. And apparently some poofs caught on in America, which did not go over well with our puritanical founding fathers. The few poofs that I read about in Boston, nobody was particularly happy about. But it was a big look in Europe for sure. Other questions? Oh, yes, please.
Is there any talk about what the king's reaction was to her clothes?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The king essentially, the common line on the king and what seems to be borne out by memoirs and stuff is that he was so grateful that she had something else to do other than hound him about not sleeping with her, that he really gave her a wider berth and freer reign than most French queens had had before her. And so she really was the one who became the public bête noire, and how dare she trample on the king's authority, how dare she outshine him, how dare she eclipse him. But in fact, he was really collusive in letting her do that. He didn't impose any limits on her spending. There are some funny things, and I talk about it in the book. He was a very humble and simple man, really didn't like the limelight, had never expected to be king, didn't want to be king, was very uncomfortable with the role, was absolutely uncomfortable with all the court ceremony. So he was happy to have Marie Antoinette get more of the attention, but he didn't like the fact that she wore these really showy clothes. And so there are memoirs that talk about him. My favorite one is actually because he was such a kind of shy and awkward guy. He once showed up at her toilette with his hair in a modified poof, saying essentially, to show her how ridiculous it looked. And she kind of laughed and ignored it, and he let her get away with it. And they did have quite a kind of a tender and loving friendship, even well before they consummated the union. But he was really as complicit in the destruction of his authority as she was, in the sense that he absolutely let her get away with it. And his predecessors, it's impossible to imagine Louis XIV or even Louis XV letting their wives run that wild and run amok in fashion or in any other way. So yeah, that's a great question. But the king didn't stop her and didn't try, it seems. Anything else? Oh, yes, please.
Would you share with us why you think the king wouldn't sleep with her?
Oh, gladly. Yeah, people always ask, and people always want to know, and the reason I don't go into it is because we don't have a lot of good historical evidence as to why. There are two schools of thought. One is that he had a medical problem that made sex very painful for him, and I won't go into that. And then the standard, it was an overly, basically it was I'll go into that. It was thought that he had an overly tight foreskin that needed to be operated on. And that theory has been discredited recently by the idea that then historians have said, oh, well, after he had the procedure in the 1780s, he finally was able to do the deed. But because he was an avid hunter and there's no interruption in his hunting schedule, which is very well documented, he probably wasn't able to have an operation like that and keep riding the way he did. So it seems like it probably wasn't a physical deformity, and it seems like the physical deformity may, in fact, that rumor may have originated at the Austrian Austrian court, that Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, and her cadre of politicos started circulating that rumor to exculpate Marie Antoinette, who was principally, as a woman always is, blamed for, she was called barren even though her husband was the one who wasn't sleeping with her. It seems the other theory, which I lend more credence to, is that he, in addition to being very timid, very overwhelmed, very socially awkward in general, he also had been raised with a real profound mistrust of the House of Austria. This was France's hereditary enemy basically until this marriage was contracted, a little bit before. They had reversed alliances a little bit before the marriage. But he had been raised by a pair of very, very anti-Austrian aristocratic tutors who had told him that his parents had actually been poisoned by spies from Austria, when in fact his parents had died of tuberculosis. So it seems that he was especially averse to becoming intimate. He never had a mistress. Unlike all French kings before him, he never had a mistress. He didn't seek out women. He was somebody who really liked hunting or being left alone to kind of tinker in a little workshop that he had. So it seems that it wasn't a problem with Marie Antoinette per se, but that his fear of Austria and of, as Antonia Fraser put it, being intimate with Austria in any way really kept him shying away from her for years. And it took her years of very hard work and trying to be his friend. And he was a figure of fun at the court. He was unattractive. He was grossly overweight. And when everybody else made fun of him, Marie Antoinette would apparently try to be nice to him. And so she won his trust, even if she was offending him maybe with her dress. And that may also be why he gave her such free rein. But I think that's probably why. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that your book's a biography, but I wondered, are you trying to make some larger claims about Marie Antoinette's use of fashion and the developments of political culture in this time? I mean, I read his biography, but historians have tended to see the larger political culture as more important than Louis XVI himself, right? So what kind of claims are you trying to make about that?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that one can definitely, I'm absolutely making claims about the importance of her clothing at this moment of political crisis in France. Her clothing didn't cause the revolution, but I think, a lot of people who've looked very closely at the way that the public relations disasters that she initiated really affected the demise of the throne had overlooked categorically time and again how important her clothing was in those public relations disasters. Secondly, but I don't think that I need to say that, or I'm certainly not trying to say that Marie Antoinette is a unique case in the broader importance of the semiotics of clothing in French political culture before or after the revolution. As I mentioned in passing, and a lot of work has been done on this, which I cite, of course, throughout my book, is the work on sartorial culture in Louis XIV. And that Louis XIV's absolutist project would not have been possible were it not for the kinds of codifications in costume that he established, along with everything else, etiquette, and aristocrats all coming to live at his court, and that's very, very well known. I mean, those are all truisms of French early modern royal culture. And finally, I think for me, one of the most important things to consider in conjunction with Marie Antoinette and her kind of cult of clothing and of sartorial self-definition at this moment is the way in which it inflected the sartorial culture of the revolution itself. Clothing was something that was hugely important to the revolutionaries. When I talked about these rioting crowds who wanted to make red ribbons of Marie Antoinette's entrails, they wanted to make red ribbons of her entrails, supposedly to make them into these tricolor rosettes that had become one of the emblems of the revolution. And the blue, white, and red symbolizing liberty, fraternity, and equality. And that rosette became a recognizable badge and indeed a supposedly transparent badge of one's political sympathies after 1789. So what Marie Antoinette really, and the sans-culotte, of course, are known by the kind of clothing that they wore, which was rejecting the aristocratic trousers and wearing the baggy workman's pants. I mentioned the fact that white and black were illegal colors to wear, especially in rosettes or ribbons, after the king's execution in 1793. So Marie Antoinette came into a culture where clothing was already something that had long been equated with political power and with the expression of political positions along a spectrum. And she's somebody who did really interesting things with that tradition. She was a limit case in many ways because she went so far in redefining what a queen could look like. But she didn't invent that problematic. I mean, that was something that had at least existed since Louis XIV and probably before. I'm not as much of a specialist of the Renaissance and the kind of the trouble that Catherine de Médicis got into for her revolutions in fashion at that time. But in the 18th century, there's no question but that clothing is one of the things that everybody is looking at as an almost transparent and quickly visible and readable, interpretable sign of political allegiance, of cultural allegiance and interest, and that was something that, so those claims are all implicit in my biography for sure. But I'm not the first person to have said that about that period at all. Yes, please. Two of Marie Antoinette's 4 children had died before the French Revolution started, and she was sent to prison with her husband, her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, Louis XVI's sister, and her 2 children. Her oldest daughter, Madame Royale, was the only member of that family to survive the revolution. She was kept alone in a cell after everybody else was killed off and was never told what had happened to any of her relatives. She was freed from jail in 1795 and went across the border to join her cousins and her uncles who had escaped and emigrated before things got really bad. She actually married the son of Marie Antoinette's favorite brother-in-law, and who then went on to become Charles X during the Revolution. So she was restored to some form of royal power, but she wrote memoirs that show the damage that was done psychologically. Absolutely. I mean, her memoirs are so painful to read because they're so devoid of emotion. You know, today they took mother. Today they walled me in alone into a cell. You know, this very kind of dry, dispassionate form of narration. And then Marie Antoinette's son is a bigger mystery, and it's at the heart of a lot of debates about who has the right to the French throne today, if anybody. He disappeared in prison after Marie Antoinette's death. He was taken from her before she was executed, dressed in the costume of a sans-culotte, taught to curse the monarchy at the top of his lungs so that she could hear him across the prison courtyard. And then he disappeared. And it's thought that either he was so maltreated and malnourished that he probably just died of some kind of sickness, but there's another theory that he was actually walled alive into one particular cell in this jail where they were. And there's a beautiful novel that's been written in France about that called La Chambre, about him dying in this room. It's horrible. But so the Bourbon throne is now passed to their cousins, but some people still like to claim that he actually got out and that they're descendants of that little boy. Yes, and then yes.
And that is that he was traded off to the Austrians so that they wouldn't attack France at a point when they were almost at the gates of Paris.
Yeah, and that one I found so little substantiation for, but yeah, it is, and that he was still alive out there somewhere too. But
all of a sudden the Austrians turned around and went home.
Yeah.
You know, and didn't attack was a bit strange, and that's what they thought.
yeah, no, yes.
I have to admit, I've seen the movie Marie Antoinette.
Oh, the Sofia Coppola one? Uh-huh.
Thought of it in terms of historical accuracy.
Oh, yeah, in terms of historical accuracy, it's, you know, it's not accurate, but it doesn't really try to be. I think one of the things I love about the movie, there are a lot of things I didn't love about the movie, but one thing I really did love about it is I loved that, unlike even the movie that I truly love, the 1938 movie of Marie Antoinette with Norma Shearer, which is worth seeing, if only for the poofs, which are incredible, almost much better than actually what Sofia Coppola's film does. What I loved about it was it tries to emphasize that this is somebody who's very young and very alone when she gets to court. And I think that's something, you know, my previous work, I'd written 2 books on the French Revolution. My sympathies had been with the Jacobins. You know, I was very, you know, I'm an Enlightenment scholar. I wasn't expecting to find her a sympathetic character when I started looking into her fashions, but I thought that what Sofia Coppola did so well in that movie was she humanized this incredibly iconic figure just by showing how young and how isolated and how overwhelmed she was by this incredibly complicated, incredibly unfriendly court. So that's what I loved. But what I found strange is the fact that, you know, nothing happens in Marie Antoinette's life in that movie. Like, her husband doesn't sleep with her, and that's the main non-happening. But there's all this politics and all this stuff that actually lead to the moment when they're forced out of Versailles at the end, and none of that is shown in the film. And so to me, at least, if I hadn't been able to supply all the gaps myself and to friends that I saw it with, it would have been like, well, why do they hate her? Why are they taking her out of the palace now? It was one long binge on clothing and shoes, and now all of a sudden she's being carted off to God knows where. So I thought it was strange that, and it was clearly a choice, a directorial choice, to make her life as if it was nothing but that kind of long party with bouts of loneliness in the middle. But that's what I didn't love so much. What did you think? Did you like it? Yeah. Did you love the clothes and the cakes and the shoes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the shoes were my favorite by far. Yes, please. I'm trying right now to get started on a book on Coco Chanel during World War II. And her involvement with a Nazi officer and her life at the Ritz. And it's something that I'm not sure how far I'm going to be able to get, because the House of Chanel controls all the archives, and this is something that they don't really like to talk about too much, her involvement with the Nazis. it's hard to get upstairs, and it's especially hard if you tell anyone that you're interested in her Nazi period. And the reason I wanted to do it is, it's not good for the brand, I'm told. So we'll see. Either I'll write the book, or I told my agent that I could write the book about trying to write the book and all the ways in which I'm going to get shot down. But it's in the very early stages because I'm still touring so much for Queen of Fashion. But that's what I'd like to do next. Yes, and then yes, please, and then you can tell me when you want to cut me off.
I was just wondering if you look at it from the perspective of gender. I mean, and compared her with Elizabeth I. I mean, does the fact that she was the spouse of a king add to the fact that she was so much shut down and sort of criticized?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the really interesting things that I talk a lot about in my book, but I didn't really get to talk about here, is the fact that there always had been, before Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, there had been a role for the hated woman, the woman that all of the kind of animosity and resentment towards the court and towards the king and the huge financial excess of the court as a whole could be directed, and that woman was the royal mistress. Madame du Barry was hugely hated in France, and all the pamphlet literature and pornographic drawings and caricatures that circulated against Marie Antoinette before Marie Antoinette came on the scene, and especially before she acceded to the throne, that same kind of stuff had been written about Madame du Barry. Oh, she's corrupting the kingdom. Oh, she's turning the king into this effeminate, old, weak sex addict who does nothing but shower money on her and destroy France. But what was so useful about that role, and it doesn't become apparent until Marie Antoinette comes along and there is no mistress, and yet she's as showy as a mistress, she's as public as a mistress as Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry were, is that all of a sudden the vitriol that gets directed towards the woman with the king, the woman behind the man, is that much closer to the throne, and she's institutionally a part of the monarchy. And so there's a large way in which the fall of the Ancien Régime, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that all of a sudden the enemy was within the court, was within the actual monarchy itself, and not this sort of upstart woman who dared to finagle her way in and became a convenient repository for all public anxieties and anger. So yeah, absolutely. And then just the gendered fact of the fact that she was, I mean, there are a lot of amazing kind of cross-dressing caricatures of Marie Antoinette showing her as the king, and there's one that I love that I reproduce in my book where he's brushing out her hair, and basically the king of France has become this subservient little servant to the queen. And so there were the French, both the revolutionaries and the old guard, had a lot of problems with the idea of a woman assuming this kind of power. As many of you probably know, when the French Revolution happened and the Declaration of the Rights of Man was accepted, women were not allowed to be citizens. You know, women were not included in the definition, or in the definition of a free French person. So there were problems with sexism among the revolutionary ranks who wanted to change everything else, as well as among the old guard. And Marie Antoinette developed an enormous negative following in both of those camps. So I think I saw one hand way back there.
Have you met any resistance from the French in doing your research?
Not so much doing my research, although it took me 2 years of begging and bureaucratic Kafkaesque, nightmarish sort of encounters to get my hands on the one bit of surviving clothing of Marie Antoinette, which is a book of her, it was called her Gazette des Atours. All of her clothes were destroyed during the Revolution, but this one book had little fabric swatches, and with her lady-in-waiting's handwriting next to it, described what each dress was, and it would be brought to Marie Antoinette every morning, and she would prick with a pin the different dresses she wanted to wear during the day. This took me 2 years to even be allowed to see. What I've met with the resistance from the French much more is just that the book still isn't translated into French, and it may not be. It's considered obviously a sympathetic look at the Queen. France is a republic. Antonia Fraser told me, who wrote the big biography of Marie Antoinette that was turned into the Sofia Coppola film, I think her book was translated into like 30 languages worldwide. She couldn't get it published in France for the first 5 years after it was published because the French didn't want any part of this sympathetic revisionist view of the Queen. And it finally came out in French because the French love Sofia Coppola. And so I don't know, maybe Sofia Coppola will make a movie of my book too, and then I can have a chance. But that's the main resistance for sure. And I had a funny experience. I had to talk at a conference on the terror last summer in this chateau in Normandy, and people started screaming in the back, saying, you know, "Are you a royalist? What are you doing here? You know, this is a republic. You know, American royalist, go home." So that's much more the. But what I always try to say is, look, it's the research. I became interested in the creative ways that she tried to establish herself when she didn't have a lot of other choices. I didn't start out trying to write some kind of apologia for Marie Antoinette and her excesses, but there's a real strong Republican current still, and I think it affected Sofia Coppola's movie's reception there too. People hated that film in France, largely I think because it was viewed as too sympathetic to this frivolous nightmare of anti-republicanism.
I only have time for one more, and if I can ask one question too beforehand.
Oh yes, please. Is this a Lacanian question? Do you want?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I was just wondering what you felt Marie Antoinette's goals were at court, to be a political power or to just fit in or be accepted?
Yeah, definitely not to fit in. Because everything she did didn't fit in, and kind of by, you know, from a very early age. No, I mean, I think her goals were not dissimilar to the goals that royal mistresses had, which is, I'm not being accepted by anyone here, but I'm going to force them to recognize that I'm a force to be reckoned with. And I'm going to do that in my self-presentation. I'm going to do it by breaking rules that nobody else is allowed to break. I'm going to do it by getting a larger public to fall in love with me, which she briefly did. And I'm going to do it by showcasing on my very person that I have access to resources that nobody else at court has. She did spend more money on clothing than any other woman at court, except maybe one of her aunts. Which is another story. But so, I mean, her goals really did seem to be, and that's something, again, that I wasn't expecting to find when I looked into her story at all. But that, and there's one letter that I quote in my book where she talks about the fact that she allows people to believe that she has more political credit than she does through this sort of program of ostentation. And she, in fact, was under pressure from her mother. She was there for diplomatic reasons, after all. Her mother, who was a very savvy political strategist, wanted to use Marie Antoinette as an Austrian pawn in the French court, high-placed, to get Marie Antoinette to change the government, the cabinet appointments, to have more cabinet members who were favorable to the interests of Austria. Marie Antoinette tried that with her husband. She lobbied for a lot of pro-Austrian cabinet members when her husband acceded to the throne. He shut her down, again, with this sort of anti-Austrian background. But she was like a one-woman Potemkin village. She kept parading around as if she were more powerful than anyone else. And to a large extent, the strategy it succeeded so well that it failed. It succeeded so well that by the time of the revolution, there was this fantasy that the queen was the woman who was pulling all the strings at court. And she was so powerful, and she was spending all of France's money, and she had to be stopped. And if there was a problem with Louis XVI, you had to look no farther than the queen. So she got what she wanted and then some, and that's why she was treated. I mean, the treatment of her in prison is an amazing thing. You know, a lot of other aristocratic and even royal prisoners during the terror were allowed to keep large, luxurious wardrobes, whole, leather-bound libraries, great wines. And the Marquis de Sade, who was in prison, had this amazing setup. And even her husband still had like 6,000 books or something brought to him in prison. Marie Antoinette was put in rags, was fed gruel. There was this real backlash in the public that, we're going to show her, we're going to get back at her for having so much, for having had so much power and so much indulged in so much excess. And I think that really was a direct function of the kind of position she wanted to put herself in, which was, I'm so powerful, you can't mess with me. And they messed with her. Reader, they messed with her. Yes, please.
Maybe we should conclude after this, but with the great appeal of your book, with the great appeal of Coppola, at the same time, what is, and this great opportunity you have to be talking across the country with all sorts of audiences interested in Marie Antoinette, what does that tell you about the character of our times in America?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, of course, and I think it's a double-edged sword. I think on the one hand, I think it's great because Marie Antoinette is somebody who, even if you look at the sort of her subsequent treatment in history, 19th century, famous 19th century histories, Michelet or the Goncourts, or 20th century history, she is somebody who gets an even more bum rap than I think she deserves, and I think that gender plays a large role in this, that there is this discourse of, implicitly, this is this uppity woman and who did her job so badly. And so I think that it's great that there's this new interest in this kind of humanizing new look at this woman in power, that Americans would care about that, because we are living in a moment when there are more women in positions of political power, when I think we all are hopefully becoming aware of the fact that there are double standards for women across the board, but certainly, women in politics and in positions of public prominence have to negotiate a very tricky line between, femininity and seriousness. And so I like the fact that there's that kind of interest in Marie Antoinette's self-presentation. Certainly, the flip side, and I wrote a piece in the New York Times about this when Coppola's movie came out. The flip side is, I think, and I'm as much guilty of this as anybody else, probably more than a lot of people in this room, there's also this sort of tabloid celebrity worship culture that is more acute in America than ever before, and I can't count the number of journalists. I can't count the number who've said to me, so basically she was the Paris Hilton of the 18th century? Or who would you say is like Marie Antoinette today? Is it Paris Hilton or Britney Spears or Madonna? And that's alarming because, my fear is that, some people maybe, I'm happy for anybody I'm grateful for anybody to buy this book, make the effort to read it, to commit to a hardback and a thick tome and a book with endnotes, although they're discreetly hidden in the back. I'm always grateful for that, but I do worry that, certainly with my book and even with the Coppola film, that maybe there are people also coming to it for the wrong reasons or that reflect something not so progressive about our time, which is this just, cult of the shallow and cult of the beautiful. And the op-ed I wrote in the Times was really about the Coppola film and how Coppola really celebrates that aspect of the Marie Antoinette myth, that it's party, 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 let them eat cake, it's also fabulous, and we're so privileged and we're Americans and we don't have to worry about the consequences of our actions. And so that's the downside, I think, of the interest in Marie Antoinette. But I urge you all to love her and appreciate the nuances and the challenges of her life and to read the book. And I thank you all for your attention so much and for this opportunity. So.